you could, okay. I'd like to start with a quote from the American playwright Arthur Miller, in which he comments that, talking about the role of the artist in society, he once said that, "I think the job of the artist is to remind people of what they have chosen to forget." During my time at Jurassic, the 30 days was such an incredible gift. I felt I had the chance to work and meet and work with so many new people. In fact, I think everybody was new to me, and to have fantastic conversations and collaborations in many different fields. So for today's talk, and I ended up producing a lot more work than I anticipated doing, and in a lot of different areas that I didn't anticipate voyaging into. So as Piero, I think, mentioned earlier, I'm giving part of my description and talk in March with the Cosmos group, because part of the work I created were poems about landscape, mentioning Meredith's collaborator. You see all the kind of interconnections between us all. Dawn, Summer, talking about the Mars landscape and other forms of landscape. So that's to be in the future in March. But so I did many things, and I decided to just focus on one thread, as it were, for the short time we have for today's talk. And that thread was to really think about poetry and memory and the cognitive science of memory. So going back to this quote, the job of the artist, reminding people of what they choose to forget. So part of the work that part of my writing has focused on my experiences growing up in Sri Lanka and the subsequent civil war and genocide that happened in that country. And so it's an interesting, and of course, for a moment to take a tangent to the very situation of civil war is one in which memory becomes a very strange phenomenon. All kinds of things start happening to memory within that process. So just to mention a few, one of the things that happens is that when you have an authoritarian government, it starts to clamp down on the media, not least of which is the written text. So writers or journalists who are trying to write about what they have seen and witnessed start to be suppressed and censored. And this is all in an attempt to control information and how it is remembered. In the end, what we see is a kind of struggle for the memory of that narrative. Who owns the narrative for that country that's at war. Another way in which memory starts to work and change in such a situation, which I've written about, is the way in which exiled expat communities hold on to their memory of that country. And once they've left that country, the form of that memory no longer really reflects what's actually happening in that country. So it becomes this strange phenomenon unto itself. And then even if you look at the people who are still in the country at the flashpoints of war, so ordinary civilians trying to live ordinary lives, what you see are the ways in which two individuals may recount an event that happens in two very different ways. The ways in which they encode that information, remember it, recall it, and then report it to the police, the army, or further journalists. So there's all kinds of work that I've tried to capture in my poetry. So I'd like to start with the type of poem that I was writing before I came to Jurassic. And so this is a kind of before and after show. So I tended to focus on, tended to use religion and metaphor and myth. So one of these poems is an attempt to witness the events of the Civil War, during which a lot of people fled from their homes and basically became pieces of paper, pieces of numbers on pieces of paper, rather, in which their identities had disappeared. So this piece harks back to the myth from the Old Testament, the story of Lot's wife, and what happens when you leave a city and you become transformed into salt. And the metaphor that you'll see me, hopefully you'll see, as the poem progresses, is the idea that it's not just that a woman turns into salt, but that some idea of your memory gets transfixed, that really what that story in the Testament is probably telling us is that idea of what happens to your mind, your memory, your trauma. So just to give you an example, here's this poem, a pre-Jurassic poem. Lot's wives. We stood, as women before us have stood, looking back at our burning cities, watching the smoke rise from our empty homes. It was quiet then and cold. We heard their cries, the caged birds clawing at their perches, our daughters naked in the hungry mob. Such death, the smell of justice drifting on the burnt wind. And we saw it all, saw the fire fall like rain, saw our tears track stiff white veins down our bodies, saw the brine crawl through salt-cracked skin. Now, turning in the restless night, we dream we stand there still, alone on the hill's black belly, we, the forgotten, whose names were swallowed by God. So that's an example. Sorry, it's a piece of paper. So as a writer, I do value the importance of bearing witness, and I hope to follow in the tradition of such poets as Yusuf Kominyaka, Primo Levi, Suji Kwok-Kwim, and Zbigniew Herbert, who, these are all poets who have placed their words on the page in memory of various conflicts and wars around the world, conditions of historical and societal uncertainty. And these are conditions in those cases, respectively, of the Vietnam War, the Holocaust, the Korean War, and the repression and state censorship in Poland. So I value the importance of bearing witness as a poet, but as a cognitive scientist, I'm also keenly aware of the mutability of memory, the mechanisms which mediate and transform the nature of our memories, that is, the physical embodiment of the memory trace within the brain. So I found that I took upon myself a challenge that I found in Dan Schechter. Dan Schechter is a cognitive psychologist at Harvard, and he has a wonderful, beguiling book, Searching for Memory. For those of you who don't know it, I'd highly recommend it. It's a fantastic art and the intersection of art and science, in which he's kind of carefully interwoven both scientific research on memory as well as examples from the visual arts. But what Dan Schechter says in the introduction of that book, he mentions that, he comments that, I have come to appreciate that artists, visual artists this is, can convey with considerable potency some of the personal, experiential aspects of memory that are difficult to communicate as effectively in words. And so I decided to take this upon myself as a bit of a challenge to see whether poetry, which after all is playing around with words, could in any way attempt to kind of match up to what visual artists have done to represent memory and you know, to live up to Dan Schechter's challenge. So this is really what I set out to do, to try and see how that forms of poetry can communicate and maybe also explore some of those findings from memory research in a more direct way. So one of the most popularly held views of memory, in that way it works in our cognition, is that it's similar to a library or a family photo album. It's a library in which our individual memories are filed and stored away in an archive. And then when we need them, these memories can be dusted off and retrieved from the archives, and these faithful copies can be brought back up into the daylight, and there they will be in their original form. So that's the wonderful kind of, it's a very popularly held view, and sadly it still continues to dominate in all kinds of political structures in our society, such as our legislature and in our journalism. So in contrast, there's a substantial body of research in the field of cognitive science for decades now that indicates that our memories are far from being static, stable, or coherent copies of reality. In fact, as Ulrich Neisser pointed out, basically trying to kind of recreate memories is like taking a few stored bone chips and trying to remember a dinosaur. It's the work of someone trying to reconstruct. We basically are constantly trying to reconstruct information. So I wanted to mention a couple of studies that highlight this. For a start, let's see, there's the work of Dan Schachter at Harvard, and he's done a series of trailblazing studies showing that what we recall, that is the information that we bring back to the surface, that book that we're pulling out of the archive in the library, can be significantly affected by the cues surrounding us at the time of recall. So to take one example from this paper, in this study, college students were given a series of trials in which they saw photos of people at the same time that they heard them speak. And they heard them speak in either a pleasant or an irritating tone of voice. So, and in some photos, the people either had slight frowns or slight scowls. So you're with me so far. So this is what you were told you had to try and memorize. Then later, during the test phase, the psychologists, because they're sneaky kinds of people, the students were shown the same photos and asked to remember what type of tone of voice the person had. And lo and behold, it turned out that if the photos tended to showed a scowling face, the students being tested said, yeah, I'm sure that was the voice that was really, the tone of voice was pretty negative. And if they were tested with photographs of people with a big beam on their face and asked, well, what kind of, what tone of voice was associated with this photograph when you had to memorize it? The students again would say, oh yes, definitely heard this person's voice and it was a happy, really jolly voice. Of course, they're completely wrong. It was complete, the psychologists being tricky people had made them completely random couplings. But the point was that the students during that recall phase were recalling things incorrectly. Right? The retrieval cue of seeing a happy face somehow meant that they were trying to access memories, and what they found, they were transforming, without realizing it, they were transforming the memory that they had back there, and they would swear blind that was really what they had remembered. So the retrieval cue, the environment in which you're in, changes the nature of what your memory is. So, and then just to, let's see. But cognitive research shows that that's just one of the many, it's just one of the many processes through which information, the information in our memory is constantly being changed, even while it resides in memory. So similar experiments have shown that prior knowledge can distort the target information through a type of fill-in. So there's a study here, this is a famous study done with baseball narratives. So in this case, Arx and Friedman gave participants, they were told to memorize a narrative about the moves in a baseball game. Great. Okay. What happened is that those who tended to know nothing about baseball, actually, let's see how the audience splits. Who knows very little about baseball? Quite a few people are willing to admit that. And who feels that they know something about baseball? Great. Well, it turns out that if you were given a baseball narrative to memorize, the people who know nothing about baseball, you have an advantage. You're actually much more accurate at recalling what you were given. Those of you who are sitting there with a kind of happy beaming smile saying, I'm an expert at baseball, when you are asked to remember things, you don't remember what you were given. You remember what you filled in, because you have all this extra expert knowledge. And that's not just because you want to see the Giants win. It's not just wishful thinking. It's actually the fact that you have extra information. So that's just one. These are just a couple of studies to give you a taster of the way in which these kinds of distortion effects happen. So given that, I started to work at Jurassic with how to introduce this idea into the physical text of poems and try to investigate the ways in which the poetic lines themselves can demonstrate that shift in meaning, that feeling in which, the way in which the memories are changing, whether that's dependent on retrieval cues, like in the Schachter study, or readers' prior knowledge, like in the Arx and Friedman baseball study. So in the course of exploring and experimenting at Gerasi and trying different ways of doing this, I found that there was one particular poetic form that's already established. It's a traditional poetic form from Malaysia called the pantun. And although that does not set out to talk about memory, I found that it really suited my purposes very well. So let us see if I shall read it. Sorry, just have to. Yes. Okay. So when we're looking at this form, what I'd like you to try and hold on to as you're listening to this is that there are repetitions in, so in the pantun form, alternate pairs of lines are preserved and then repeated through the poem. But what happens, what I've tried to do, is that although I've taken the lines and repeated them, which you can hear that in a nursery rhyme, lines repeat in a chorus, in the case that I'm trying to work with, I've tried to see how I can change the meaning in the same way that memories that we've encoded change once they're stored. So, okay, let's have a shot. Okay. I'll read it out loud and then I'll put it on the screen, because as a psychologist I know that all kinds of funny things happen if I'm reading and you're watching text. So if you'll bear with me, I'll read it. And again, it's referencing Sri Lanka. Around us in the playground, the children running in all directions, such wild games, their eyes dancing, playing catch under the trees. And now you'll hear the repetition. The children are running in all directions, and a new line. The school under suspicion, so many soldiers, repetition, playing catch under the trees. The heat erases the blank noon sky. The school still under suspicion. The soldiers are counting the children, separating girls from the boys. Outside, the heat is erasing the blank noon sky. The sound of old rifles caught and reloaded. Count all the children, the girls and the boys, the faces disappearing into the forest. The parts of the rifle are studied and reloaded, and in the dim school hall, the portraits are changing. The faces disappearing into the forest, they leave me behind and become a new story. Even now, if you look, their portraits are changing, and the sand gathers under the sky. They have left me behind and become a new story, with their raw games and their wild eyes dancing, and the sand creeps into old, small footprints around me in the playground. Oh, sorry. So you can see in this case, and let's just see if the laser works, there we go. You can see the repetition. The children are running in all directions, and in the first verse you think of it as an innocent landscape, but then by the time you get to the second verse, with the insertion of the second line, where the war is starting to happen, you can see the very same line, the children are running in all directions, takes on a new meaning. And so this continues throughout the structure of the pantun, and then it finally cycles back to the first few lines that you'll see in the verse structure. So my second set of poetry investigations took as their jumping off point an understanding of the mechanisms underlying traumatic memory. And so I can talk during the questions about what kinds of research studies led to that, but here's an example of the actual poem. And what I decided to do was look at the fugue structure. So partly I was drawing on this idea that in traumatized memories, there's a consistent way in which these memories continue to intrude on the memory of the individual after an event. You can't help it, you keep having these memories being recalled. And then thinking about Nice's comment about these fragments of dinosaurs, I decided to use this fugue form. Now, Paul Celan wrote a very famous poem called Todes Fugue, Death Fugue, based on his recollections of, based on the Holocaust. But as many literary critics, such as Shira Wolofsky, have commented, in Celan's case, he really wanted to bring up the context of the idea of a tango, which was the kind of music that was played during the concentration camp incidents that he was describing. But instead, what I've been trying to do with this fugue is to create the idea of a kind of an intrusive, a repetition of certain phrases that keep happening again and again. And this is just half of the poem. I'll give you it as a taster. Again, talking about the children in the Civil War. We were born, we were named, we were schoolgirls dressed in white cotton. There were bells, there were lessons, the light like a mirror breaking over the lagoon. We learned dates, we learned names, we tied up our braids with long ribbons. There are bells, there are lessons, we march in white lines, and the priest takes our confession. We hear soldiers, checkpoints, our brothers trapped between sandbags, the drum roll of boats across the lagoon. We learn dates, we learn names, fill kerosene in bottles, douse the white cotton. We are schoolgirls in white, our braids in long ribbons. And so it goes on. And so it's a way in which I'm taking, in this case, small fragments, but constantly changing them and to shift their meaning and to give one a sense of what happens in traumatized memory. And I have quite a few other examples, which will be in the book. But I'd like to end by, so those are some examples, and I'd like to end, finally, to conclude by, with this quote: a poem is really a kind of machine. So when the French poet Paul Valéry said this, he was really referring to the ways in which poems can be used to induce a specific kind of emotional state in the reader. And in contrast, what I've hoped to do instead was to follow the pathway of contemporary prose writers such as W.G. Sebald, who've looked at the inconsistencies of history and memory by playing with the physical text that Sebald puts into his books. So you see these disruptions of text. He practically bends the story in different ways across the page. And it's very masterly work done in prose. And so what I've attempted to do is, in some small shadow of that, is to try and emulate that through poetry, to try not just to grasp the physical content of what happened in the Civil War and the actual sort of content, the emotional content, but to also give some sense of the deterioration of memory and the different ways in which that content is being shifted and changed, not just in my mind, but in your mind as the reader as you go forth. So I think I'll leave it there and open up to questions. Thank you very much.